In the annals of European monarchy, few figures embody the shocking disconnect between royal grandeur and personal hygiene as dramatically as Isabella I of Castile, a queen whose legendary aversion to bathing became both a symbol of religious devotion and a source of pestilence that would plague her court for decades. Born in 1451, Isabella would rise to become one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, uniting Spain, funding Columbus's voyages, and establishing the Spanish Inquisition. Yet beneath her crown and royal robes festered a body so encrusted with filth and disease that courtiers would faint from the stench, and her personal hygiene became a matter of international diplomatic concern that threatened alliances and sparked rumors of divine punishment. Isabella's rejection of bathing was not born from ignorance or poverty, but from a deliberate religious conviction that cleanliness of the body was incompatible with purity of the soul. In an era when the Catholic Church taught that physical suffering brought one closer to God, the Queen embraced filth as a form of spiritual discipline, believing that the discomfort and disease caused by her unwashed state would earn her divine favor and demonstrate her commitment to Christian virtue. This twisted interpretation of religious doctrine would transform the Spanish court into a breeding ground for disease and create a culture of deliberate uncleanliness that would influence European hygiene practices for generations. The Queen's daily routine was a carefully orchestrated ritual of avoiding water at all costs, with elaborate protocols designed to ensure that no drop of cleansing liquid would ever touch her royal skin. Her morning ablutions consisted of having servants dust her body with dry cloths and apply heavy perfumes and powders to mask the overwhelming stench that emanated from her unwashed flesh. The layers of cosmetics, oils, and aromatic substances that were applied to her body created a thick, waxy coating that trapped dirt, sweat, and bodily secretions, creating an environment so conducive to bacterial growth that her skin became a living laboratory of infection and disease. The physical consequences of Isabella's hygiene practices were both immediate and horrifying, as contemporary accounts describe a monarch whose body was covered in open sores, rashes, and infections that never healed due to the constant accumulation of filth and the complete absence of cleansing. The Queen's hair, which was never washed throughout her adult life, became a matted, greasy mass that harbored lice, fleas, and other parasites in such numbers that courtiers reported seeing insects crawling across her scalp during formal audiences. Her teeth, blackened and rotting from years of neglect, emitted such a foul odor that diplomats would position themselves upwind during negotiations to avoid the nauseating smell of her breath. The court physicians, caught between their medical knowledge and the political necessity of supporting the Queen's religious convictions, developed elaborate theories to justify her hygiene practices while secretly documenting the devastating health consequences of her unwashed state. Dr. Rodrigo Maldonado, the royal physician, wrote in his private journals about the Queen's chronic skin infections, digestive disorders, and respiratory problems that he directly attributed to her refusal to bathe. However, his public pronouncements praised the Queen's spiritual discipline and claimed that her physical suffering was evidence of divine favor rather than the predictable result of deliberate uncleanliness. The international diplomatic implications of Isabella's hygiene became a source of constant embarrassment for Spanish ambassadors, who were forced to warn foreign courts about the Queen's condition before state visits to prevent diplomatic incidents. The French court, known for its own elaborate hygiene rituals, was particularly horrified by reports of the Spanish Queen's filthiness, with King Louis XV reportedly refusing to meet with Isabella in person due to concerns about the health risks posed by her unwashed state. These diplomatic tensions created lasting strains in European alliances and contributed to Spain's growing isolation from other major powers. The case of the Venetian ambassador Marco Foscari illustrates the international shock caused by Isabella's hygiene practices. Foscari's detailed reports to the Venetian Senate describe his horror at encountering the Queen during a formal audience in 1478, noting that the stench from her unwashed body was so overwhelming that several members of his diplomatic party became physically ill. His description of the Queen's appearance, matted hair crawling with insects, blackened teeth and skin covered in open sores, created such a sensation in Venice that copies of his report were circulated throughout European courts as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism. The religious justifications for Isabella's hygiene practices were rooted in a twisted interpretation of Christian asceticism that transformed personal cleanliness into a form of spiritual corruption. The Queen's confessors, led by the fanatical Tomás de Torquemada, taught that washing the body was a form of vanity that distracted from spiritual concerns, and that physical suffering, including the discomfort caused by filth and disease, was a pathway to salvation. This doctrine was used to justify not only the Queen's personal hygiene practices, but also the broader persecution of Muslims and Jews, who were portrayed as spiritually corrupt, partly because of their emphasis on ritual cleanliness. The economic consequences of the Queen's hygiene extended far beyond personal discomfort, as the constant need for perfumes, cosmetics, and aromatic substances to mask her stench created enormous expenses for the royal treasury. The Spanish court employed teams of perfumers, apothecaries, and cosmetic specialists whose sole job was to develop new methods for concealing the Queen's odor and appearance. The cost of these efforts, combined with the frequent replacement of clothing, bedding, and furniture that became contaminated by contact with the Queen's unwashed body, represented a significant drain on royal resources that could have been used for more productive purposes. The impact of Isabella's hygiene on her personal relationships was devastating, as even her closest family members struggled to endure her presence for extended periods. Her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, reportedly maintained separate living quarters and limited his contact with the Queen to brief formal meetings that were necessary for state business. Their children learned to hold their breath during audiences with their mother and often developed respiratory problems that court physicians attributed to prolonged exposure to the toxic atmosphere surrounding the Queen. The servants and courtiers who were forced to attend to Isabella's personal needs suffered disproportionately from the health consequences of her hygiene practices, as their daily exposure to her unwashed body and contaminated belongings created a constant risk of infection and disease. The Queen's personal attendants had an extraordinarily high mortality rate, with many dying from mysterious illnesses that modern medical experts would recognize as infections transmitted through contact with her filthy clothing, bedding, and personal effects. The turnover among her personal staff was so high that the position of royal chambermaid became essentially a death sentence. The architectural modifications made to royal residences to accommodate Isabella's hygiene practices reveal the extent to which her personal habits affected the entire court infrastructure. Special ventilation systems were installed to remove the noxious odors from her chambers, while elaborate drainage systems were constructed to handle the runoff from the massive quantities of perfumes and aromatic oils used to mask her stench. The Queen's personal quarters were equipped with multiple layers of tapestries and curtains that could be replaced frequently as they became saturated with the odors emanating from her unwashed body. The medical consequences of Isabella's hygiene practices extended far beyond simple discomfort, as her unwashed state created ideal conditions for the development and transmission of serious diseases that would affect not only the Queen herself, but also everyone who came into contact with her. The chronic skin infections that covered her body served as breeding grounds for dangerous bacteria that could cause life-threatening illnesses in anyone who touched contaminated surfaces or breathed the infected air surrounding her. The parasites that infested her hair and clothing spread throughout the royal residences, creating health hazards that persisted long after the Queen had left a particular location. The psychological effects of Isabella's hygiene practices on the broader court culture were profound and lasting, as her example normalized and even glorified deliberate uncleanliness as a mark of spiritual superiority. Courtiers began competing to demonstrate their own religious devotion by adopting increasingly extreme hygiene practices, creating a culture of competitive filthiness that transformed the Spanish court into one of the most unsanitary environments in medieval Europe. This cultural shift had lasting consequences for Spanish society, contributing to higher rates of disease and mortality that would persist for generations. The documentation of Isabella's hygiene practices in contemporary sources provides a wealth of evidence about the shocking reality of royal life in medieval Spain, while also revealing the extent to which political and religious considerations could override basic health and sanitation concerns. Chronicles, diplomatic reports, and personal accounts from the period paint a consistent picture of a monarch whose deliberate embrace of filth created a public health crisis that affected thousands of people and contributed to Spain's reputation as a backward and unsanitary nation. The international medical community of the time was horrified by reports of Isabella's condition, with physicians from across Europe writing treatises that used the Spanish Queen as an example of how religious extremism could lead to dangerous health practices. These medical writings, while often couched in diplomatic language to avoid offending Spanish sensibilities, provided detailed descriptions of the diseases and infections that resulted from prolonged unwashing and served as warnings to other rulers about the dangers of similar practices. As Isabella's reign progressed and her hygiene practices became more extreme, the stage was set for even greater health disasters that would affect not only the Queen herself, but also the broader Spanish population. The culture of deliberate uncleanliness that she had established at court began to spread throughout Spanish society, creating conditions that would make the kingdom particularly vulnerable to epidemic diseases and contributing to the social and economic problems that would plague Spain for centuries to come. The Spanish royal court under Isabella I became a veritable breeding ground for disease and pestilence, as the Queen's deliberate rejection of hygiene transformed the magnificent palaces of Castile into fetid, charnel houses where courtiers, servants, and visitors alike fell victim to a horrifying array of infections, parasitic infestations, and epidemic diseases that spread with terrifying speed through the unwashed corridors of power. The very air within the royal residences became toxic, laden with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste that accumulated in corners and crevices where no cleaning was permitted, lest it interfere with the Queen's spiritual discipline of embracing filth as a pathway to divine favor. The daily mortality rate within Isabella's court reached levels that would have been shocking even by medieval standards, as servants, courtiers, and visitors succumbed to diseases that thrived in the unsanitary conditions that the Queen's hygiene practices had created throughout the royal residences. The palace morgues, originally designed to handle the occasional death from natural causes or political violence, were overwhelmed by the constant stream of bodies from victims of dysentery, typhus, plague, and countless other diseases that found perfect breeding conditions in the filth-encrusted environment of the Spanish court. The smell of death became so pervasive that it mingled with the other noxious odors to create an atmosphere of decay that visitors described as resembling the gates of hell. The case of the Burgundian embassy of 1479 provides a stark illustration of how Isabella's hygiene practices had transformed diplomatic visits into potential death sentences for foreign dignitaries. The embassy, led by Philippe de Comines, arrived at the Spanish court with a retinue of 37 members, including diplomats, servants, and guards. Within 2 weeks of their arrival, 23 members of the embassy had fallen ill with various diseases, and by the end of their month-long stay, 11 had died from infections that they had contracted within the royal palace. Carmine's detailed account of the visit describes the horror of watching his companions succumb to mysterious illnesses while being forced to continue diplomatic negotiations in an environment that he compared to a plague house. The water supply systems within the royal palaces became contaminated beyond any hope of purification, as the Queen's prohibition against cleaning extended to the wells, cisterns, and aqueducts that supplied water to the court. The accumulated filth from years of neglect created a toxic soup that served as a breeding ground for cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases that spread rapidly through anyone who consumed the contaminated liquid. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that a queen who refused to use water for cleaning had also made water unfit for drinking, creating a double assault on the health of everyone within her domain. The food preparation areas within the royal kitchens became scenes of unimaginable horror, as the combination of contaminated water, unwashed utensils, and food handlers who were forbidden from cleaning themselves created ideal conditions for food poisoning on a massive scale. The royal banquets, once symbols of Spanish magnificence and hospitality, became notorious throughout Europe as potential death traps where guests might enjoy a sumptuous meal only to die agonizing deaths from the diseases transmitted through contaminated food. The mortality rate among dinner guests became so high that foreign ambassadors began bringing their own food and water to royal functions, creating diplomatic incidents that further damaged Spain's international reputation. Dr. Alfonso de Córdoba, one of the few court physicians who dared to document the true extent of the health crisis within the royal palace, kept detailed records of the diseases and deaths that he witnessed during his service to the Queen. His secret medical journals, discovered centuries later in the archives of the University of Salamanca, provide a horrifying catalogue of the pestilence that ravaged the Spanish court. His entries describe outbreaks of bubonic plague that killed dozens of courtiers within days, epidemics of typhus that spread through the servant quarters like wildfire, and mysterious wasting diseases that caused victims to literally rot away while still alive. The laundry facilities within the royal palaces were abandoned entirely, as the Queen's religious convictions prohibited the washing of clothing, bedding, or any textile that came into contact with human bodies. The accumulated filth on clothing and linens created perfect breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and other parasites that carried deadly diseases throughout the court. The bedchambers of courtiers became infested with insects to such an extent that sleeping became a form of torture, as occupants were constantly bitten and infected by the parasites that thrived in the unwashed fabrics that surrounded them. The case of the Countess of Benavente illustrates the devastating personal consequences of the court's hygiene practices. The Countess, a prominent member of Isabella's inner circle, developed a severe case of typhus that was transmitted through lice infestations in her unwashed clothing. Despite her high social position and access to the best medical care available, she died within a week of the onset of symptoms, her body covered in the characteristic rash and fever that marked victims of the disease. Her death sent shockwaves through the Spanish nobility and led to the first serious discussions about the need for hygiene reform within the royal court. The architectural structure of the royal palaces began to deteriorate rapidly under the assault of accumulated filth and the corrosive effects of the toxic atmosphere that pervaded the royal residences. The stone walls became stained and pitted by the acidic compounds that formed from the decomposition of organic matter, while the wooden beams and floors began to rot from the constant exposure to moisture and bacterial contamination. The magnificent tapestries and artwork that had once adorned the palace walls were destroyed by the corrosive atmosphere, creating a visual symbol of the decay that had infected every aspect of court life. The economic costs of the health crisis within the royal court reached astronomical proportions, as the constant need to replace dead servants, purchase expensive medicines, and maintain the elaborate systems designed to mask the Queen's stench drained the royal treasury. The Spanish crown was forced to spend enormous sums on importing healthy servants from distant regions, as local populations had learned to avoid employment at the royal court due to the high mortality rates among palace staff. The cost of medical care for the constant stream of sick and dying courtiers became one of the largest items in the royal budget, competing with military expenses and diplomatic initiatives for scarce resources. The international medical community began to take notice of the health crisis in the Spanish court, with physicians from across Europe writing detailed studies of the diseases and conditions that they observed during visits to Isabella's palaces. Dr. Marsilio Ficino, the renowned Italian physician and philosopher, wrote extensively about his observations of the Spanish court, describing it as a living laboratory for the study of how poor hygiene could create and spread disease. His writings, widely circulated throughout European medical schools, used the Spanish court as a cautionary example of how political and religious extremism could override basic health considerations with catastrophic results. The psychological impact of the constant presence of death and disease within the royal court created a culture of fatalism and despair that affected every aspect of court life. Courtiers developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to protect themselves from the diseases that surrounded them, while others embraced a hedonistic philosophy that emphasized immediate pleasure in the face of probable death. The normal social hierarchies and protocols of court life began to break down as the shared experience of surviving in a pestilent environment created bonds that transcended traditional class distinctions. The religious implications of the health crisis within the Spanish court created theological debates that would influence Catholic doctrine for generations. Some religious authorities argued that the diseases and deaths were divine punishment for the court's sins, while others maintained that the suffering was a form of spiritual purification that would ultimately lead to salvation. The Queen's own confessors struggled to reconcile their support for her hygiene practices with the obvious evidence that these practices were causing enormous suffering and death among innocent people. The military consequences of the court's health problems became apparent when Spanish armies began to suffer from unusually high rates of disease and mortality that could be traced directly to infections contracted during service at the royal court. Soldiers who had served as palace guards or participated in royal ceremonies often carried diseases back to their units, creating outbreaks that could decimate entire regiments. The Spanish military's effectiveness was significantly reduced by these health problems, contributing to several military defeats that might have been avoided if the army had not been weakened by court-transmitted diseases. The agricultural regions surrounding the royal palaces began to experience their own health crises as diseases from the court spread to local populations through contact with servants, suppliers, and other individuals who traveled between the palace and the surrounding communities. Entire villages were wiped out by epidemics that could be traced directly to contact with the royal court, creating a pattern of death and devastation that extended far beyond the palace walls. The economic impact of these rural epidemics was enormous, as agricultural production declined and tax revenues fell due to the high mortality rates among the peasant population. The diplomatic consequences of the health crisis extended beyond simple embarrassment to create serious obstacles to Spanish foreign policy objectives. Foreign courts began to refuse to receive Spanish ambassadors due to concerns about disease transmission, while potential marriage alliances were abandoned when foreign royalty learned about the health conditions within the Spanish court. The isolation that resulted from these health concerns contributed to Spain's growing political isolation and reduced its influence in European affairs at a crucial period in its history. The documentation of the health crisis within Isabella's court provides modern historians with an unprecedented window into how poor hygiene practices could create public health disasters on a massive scale. Contemporary accounts from courtiers, diplomats, physicians, and other observers paint a consistent picture of a royal court that had become a center of disease and death due to the deliberate rejection of basic sanitation principles. These historical records serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of public health measures and the dangers of allowing political or religious considerations to override scientific evidence about disease prevention. As the health crisis within the Spanish court continued to worsen and its effects spread throughout the kingdom, it became clear that Isabella's hygiene practices had created a public health emergency that threatened not only the immediate members of the court, but also the broader Spanish population and even neighboring countries. The stage was set for an even more comprehensive examination of how the Queen's personal habits had created a culture of disease and death that would have lasting consequences for Spanish society and European history. The catastrophic hygiene practices of Queen Isabella I created a cultural legacy of deliberate uncleanliness that would plague Spanish society for centuries, establishing patterns of disease transmission, social dysfunction, and international isolation that fundamentally altered the trajectory of Spanish history and contributed to the kingdom's eventual decline from its position as Europe's dominant power. The Queen's transformation of filth into a religious virtue created a social model that was emulated throughout Spanish society, from the highest levels of the aristocracy to the poorest peasant communities, resulting in a nationwide public health crisis that would make Spain one of the most disease-ridden and unsanitary countries in medieval Europe. The Spanish nobility, eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the crown and their commitment to the same religious principles that motivated the Queen's hygiene practices, began adopting increasingly extreme forms of deliberate uncleanliness as markers of social status and spiritual superiority. The Duke of Alba, one of Spain's most powerful nobles, publicly declared that he had not bathed in over a decade and encouraged his followers to embrace similar practices as demonstrations of their Christian devotion. This aristocratic embrace of filth created a competitive dynamic where nobles vied with each other to achieve ever more extreme levels of uncleanliness, transforming the Spanish court into a showcase of deliberate squalor that horrified foreign visitors and diplomats. The case of the Marquis of Santillana illustrates the extent to which Isabella's hygiene practices influenced the broader Spanish nobility. The Marquis, seeking to curry favor with the Queen, adopted an even more extreme version of her hygiene regimen, refusing not only to bathe but also to change his clothing or allow his servants to clean his living quarters. His palace became so contaminated and disease-ridden that it was eventually abandoned by his own family, who fled to distant estates to escape the toxic environment that his deliberate uncleanliness had created. The Marquis himself died of a mysterious wasting disease that modern medical experts believe was caused by chronic infection resulting from his refusal to maintain basic hygiene. The Spanish Catholic Church, under the influence of fanatical religious leaders like Tomás de Torquemada, began incorporating deliberate uncleanliness into official religious doctrine, teaching that physical cleanliness was incompatible with spiritual purity, and that the discomfort caused by filth and disease was a form of penance that brought believers closer to God. This theological justification for poor hygiene was disseminated throughout Spain, through sermons, religious texts, and educational curricula that reached every level of society. The result was a systematic indoctrination that convinced millions of Spanish citizens that maintaining basic hygiene was not only unnecessary, but actually sinful. The educational institutions of Spain, from the most prestigious universities to the humblest village schools, began teaching hygiene practices based on the royal model, creating generations of Spanish citizens who were systematically trained to reject basic sanitation principles. The University of Salamanca, one of Europe's oldest and most respected centers of learning, developed curricula that explicitly condemned bathing and other hygiene practices as forms of vanity and spiritual corruption. These educational policies created an educated class that was not only ignorant of basic health principles, but actively opposed to implementing them. The economic consequences of Spain's embrace of deliberate uncleanliness were devastating and far-reaching, as the constant presence of disease and the high mortality rates associated with poor hygiene created massive inefficiencies in every sector of the economy. Agricultural productivity declined as rural populations suffered from chronic illness and high death rates, while urban centers became breeding grounds for epidemic diseases that could wipe out entire neighborhoods within weeks. The cost of medical care and the constant need to replace dead workers created enormous drains on both public and private resources. The international trade relationships that were crucial to Spain's economic prosperity began to deteriorate as foreign merchants and traders became reluctant to visit Spanish ports and cities due to the health risks associated with the country's poor hygiene practices. The Venetian merchant Giovanni Caboto reported that his trading company had abandoned its Spanish operations entirely after losing dozens of employees to diseases contracted during business trips to Spanish cities. Similar reports from Flemish, German, and English traders created a pattern of commercial isolation that significantly reduced Spain's participation in the lucrative international trade networks that were driving European economic growth. The military consequences of Spain's hygiene crisis became apparent during the Italian wars of the early 16th century, when Spanish armies suffered disproportionately high casualty rates from disease compared to their French and imperial opponents. The Spanish military's reputation for poor hygiene made it difficult to recruit foreign mercenaries and created logistical problems when Spanish forces attempted to operate alongside Allied armies. The siege of Naples in 1503 saw Spanish forces lose more soldiers to disease than to enemy action, largely due to the poor sanitation practices that Spanish commanders had learned from the royal court. The case of the Spanish expedition to the Americas reveals how Isabella's hygiene legacy affected even Spain's colonial enterprises. The conquistadors who traveled to the New World carried with them not only European diseases, but also the Spanish cultural attitudes toward hygiene that made them particularly effective vectors for disease transmission. The devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous American populations was exacerbated by the Spanish colonists' deliberate rejection of hygiene practices that might have reduced the spread of infection. The result was demographic catastrophes that wiped out entire civilizations and created lasting patterns of disease and social dysfunction in Spanish colonial territories. The diplomatic isolation that resulted from Spain's reputation for poor hygiene had profound consequences for the country's foreign policy objectives and its ability to form the international alliances that were crucial for maintaining its position as a European power. The French court of Louis XIV refused to receive Spanish ambassadors in person, conducting all diplomatic business through intermediaries to avoid the health risks associated with direct contact with Spanish officials. Similar policies adopted by other European courts created a pattern of diplomatic isolation that made it increasingly difficult for Spain to pursue its foreign policy objectives. The cultural and intellectual consequences of Spain's embrace of deliberate uncleanliness extended far beyond immediate health concerns to affect the country's participation in the broader European Renaissance and Enlightenment movements. The Spanish rejection of empirical observation and scientific method in favor of religious dogma about hygiene created intellectual barriers that prevented Spanish scholars from participating in the scientific revolution that was transforming European thought. The result was a growing intellectual isolation that paralleled the country's diplomatic and economic isolation. The case of the Spanish Inquisition reveals how hygiene practices became entangled with religious persecution and social control in ways that further damaged Spanish society. The Inquisition's persecution of Muslims and Jews was partly justified by claims that these groups' emphasis on ritual cleanliness demonstrated their spiritual corruption and rejection of true Christian values. This persecution not only eliminated some of Spain's most productive and educated citizens, but also reinforced the cultural association between cleanliness and religious heresy that made hygiene reform politically dangerous. The demographic consequences of Spain's poor hygiene practices were catastrophic, with mortality rates that exceeded those of other European countries by significant margins throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. The constant presence of epidemic diseases, combined with the chronic health problems caused by poor sanitation, created a demographic crisis that reduced Spain's population and weakened its human resources at a crucial period in its history. The high infant mortality rates and reduced life expectancy associated with poor hygiene practices meant that Spain was unable to maintain the population growth necessary to support its expanding empire and growing economic responsibilities. The architectural and urban planning consequences of Spain's hygiene crisis are still visible today in the layout and design of Spanish cities, which often lack the sophisticated water and sewage systems that were developed in other European countries during the same period. The Spanish rejection of public health infrastructure as incompatible with religious values created urban environments that were particularly vulnerable to disease outbreaks, and that required extensive modernization efforts in later centuries to bring them up to European standards. The international medical community began to use Spain as a case study in how cultural and religious factors could override scientific evidence about disease prevention, with physicians from across Europe writing detailed analyses of the Spanish hygiene crisis and its consequences. These medical studies, while often diplomatically worded to avoid offending Spanish sensibilities, provided clear evidence of the connection between poor hygiene practices and increased disease rates, contributing to the development of modern public health theory and practice. The literary and artistic legacy of Spain's hygiene crisis can be seen in the works of Spanish authors and artists who documented the social and cultural consequences of the country's embrace of deliberate uncleanliness. The picaresque novels of the 16th and 17th centuries often featured characters whose adventures took them through the disease-ridden and unsanitary environments that had become characteristic of Spanish society, while Spanish artists developed distinctive styles that reflected the decay and corruption that pervaded Spanish culture. The long-term consequences of Isabella's hygiene legacy continued to affect Spanish society well into the modern era, as the cultural attitudes and institutional structures that had been created during her reign proved remarkably resistant to reform efforts. Even as other European countries began to adopt modern hygiene practices and public health measures, Spain continued to lag behind due to the deep-seated cultural resistance to cleanliness that had been established during the medieval period. The result was a pattern of public health problems and social dysfunction that persisted into the 20th century and contributed to Spain's continued isolation from mainstream European development. The ultimate tragedy of Isabella's hygiene legacy lies not only in the immediate suffering and death that it caused, but in its demonstration of how individual choices by powerful leaders can create cultural patterns that persist for centuries and affect millions of people. The Queen's personal decision to embrace filth as a form of religious devotion created a social model that was institutionalized throughout Spanish society. and that continued to cause suffering long after she and her immediate contemporaries had died. The legacy of her reign serves as a powerful reminder of the responsibility that leaders bear for the long-term consequences of their actions and the importance of basing policy decisions on scientific evidence rather than personal prejudice or religious extremism.